When you picture like a democratic revolution, your mind probably jumps straight to those cinematic moments.
Right, the big dramatic scenes.
Yeah, exactly. You imagine millions of people protesting in the streets, or statues of dictators being pulled down, or just citizens dropping ballots into a box.
It's the narrative we prefer, because it offers a very clear climax.
Right.
The old regime falls, the new flag goes up, and the story ostensibly ends, with a victory for human rights.
But what if I told you that those revolutions aren't actually won in the streets?
Yeah.
That, historically speaking, they are actually won or lost at the bank.
Yeah, that morning after is the ultimate reality check.
Exactly, because the incoming government walks into the presidential palace, sits down, and realizes they have to figure out how to keep the power grid running.
And the grocery shelves stocked. Because if the treasury is empty and, supply chains are broken, the public's patience with their new freedom just evaporates.
It's terrifying how fast it happens.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today, you and I are unpacking a massive stack of sources. We've got macroeconomic models, historical case studies, and a very specific policy blueprint called the Iran Prosperity Project.
It's a fascinating document.
It really is. Our mission for you today is to understand the absolute necessity of economic restructuring during a democratic transition. Specifically, how financial stability isn't just some abstract goal for a potential new government in Iran. It's literally their survival mechanism.
Right. And before we really jump into the mechanics of this, I need to establish a very clear parameter regarding our source material today.
Good idea.
Yeah, these documents include politically charged proposals from opposition groups, most notably the exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's plan for a transitional government.
Right.
So we want to emphasize to you, the listener, that we are not endorsing any political viewpoint here.
No, not at all.
And we aren't advocating for regime change. Our role is strictly to analyze the economic roadmaps and the factual context provided in these sources.
So looking at the mechanics, okay, so let's unpack this. Is taking over a country post-revolution basically like a startup trying to take over a bankrupt, corrupt legacy monopoly?
That's actually a great way to look at it.
Because you have this new management team coming in with big ideas, but if you don't fix the accounting on day one and make payroll, the whole thing just folds.
It folds immediately. And taking that startup analogy a step further, imagine that the old monopoly also deliberately destroyed the ledgers on their way out the door.
Oh, wow. So you're flying blind.
Completely blind. The transitional government inherits a populace that expects immediate dividends from their new freedom. And when those dividends don't materialize, we see a phenomenon that political economists call authoritarian nostalgia.
Authoritarian nostalgia.
Yeah.
That sounds like a total contradiction in terms.
I know, it does.
Like, why would anyone feel nostalgic for a regime that actively suppressed their rights?
Well, it happens when the immediate pain of economic collapse basically outweighs the memory of political oppression. Yeah. When a new democracy fails to deliver basic material stability, like when unemployment spikes or hyperinflation makes it impossible to just buy calories, the public quickly forgets the human rights abuses.
The collective memory just sort of distorts.
Exactly. People simply remember that, well, under the dictator, bread was cheap and the streets felt orderly.
Wow. So if economic dignity is the prerequisite for democracy, we can see how quickly this unravels in our sources. Like, take Tunisia.
Right, the Arab Spring.
Yeah, after the Arab Spring, they went through what analysts now call a black decade. Because on paper, they did everything right.
They drafted a liberal constitution,
Held free elections, fostered a civil society. But the new government completely failed to dismantle the crony capitalism.
and the Tunisian public essentially realized that, the freedom to vote didn't pay their rent.
Yeah.
That economic stagnation directly paved the way for President Kais Saied's self-coup in 2021.
When he dissolved the parliament.
Right. And a huge portion of the public supported it because they were trading democratic gridlock for the promise of, decisive economic action.
Which is wild to think about. And we see a similar structural failure in the Philippines, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The People Power Revolution ousted Ferdinand Marcos, massive victory for democracy globally. But they didn't break the economic stranglehold of the elite class.
Which led to decades of disillusionment.
Exactly, which laid the exact groundwork for the rise of Rodrigo Duterte. It proves that holding formal elections is basically meaningless if you don't rewrite the economic rules.
And the historical record points to a specific mechanism that explains why this happens. It draws on something called the Barrow effect, which operates alongside Lipset's modernization theory.
Okay, unpack that for me.
So the underlying thesis is that introducing democracy can, counterintuitively, actually damage economic growth in the short term.
That seems completely backward. I mean, you'd think open markets and transparency would instantly boost growth.
You would think so. But authoritarian regimes often suppress wages, right? And they ban labor unions to artificially boost capital accumulation for the state.
Right.
When democracy is introduced, the dam breaks. Newly empowered voters immediately demand higher wages, expansive social welfare, redistribution of wealth.
And the new government have to give in to survive the next election.
Exactly. They start deficit spending, which triggers capital flight, scares off foreign investment, and suddenly you have a massive spike in inflation.
So the very act of democratizing creates an economic shockwave that threatens to kill the democracy itself.
Yes, and Lipset's modernization theory argues that the only way a democracy survives long-term is by cultivating a financially stable middle class.
Because they act as a stabilizing buffer.
Precisely. They have a vested interest in the rule of law, property rights, moderate politics. What's fascinating here is that democracy isn't simply a political choice. It's an economic evolution.
Okay, let me challenge the framing of that for a second.
Go for it.
Are you saying democracy is like a luxury good? That if people are starving, human rights just take a back seat to the price of wheat?
It's less about democracy being a luxury and more about the brutal reality of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Meaning survival comes first.
Right. If a government cannot facilitate basic material survival, if the currency is basically confetti and food supply chains break down, the social contract is voided.
Yeah, the political system becomes irrelevant. Which brings us to the terrifying reality of Iran's current economic baseline.
It's incredibly bleak.
If a stable economy is required for a transition to survive, the data from our sources for April 2026 shows a starting line that borders on the impossible.
The macroeconomic indicators reflect an economy in systemic failure.
The mechanics are staggering. The Iranian shekel has plummeted to 1.7 million to the US dollar in the parallel market.
And point-to-point inflation on basic necessities is sitting at 73.5%.
It's unbelievable. 7 million Iranians are facing active hunger. And the mechanism the government is using to handle this is what really caught my attention.
The credit scheme.
Yes. They implemented a scheme that forces citizens to buy basic food on credit against future cash subsidies.
It is essentially the government forcing its population to take out subprime loans against their own caloric needs.
It's so dark.
They're mortgaging the future welfare of the citizenry just to prevent food riots today.
A bizarre futures market for basic survival. Now, the knee-jerk reaction for most people is to point at international sanctions and say, well, there's your hyperinflation.
Right, but our sources argue the structural pathology goes much deeper.
It's rooted in what they term the military boneyard complex. Let's break down how that actually operates. The boneyards are the religious foundations, correct?
They originated as charitable foundations, yeah. But over decades, they've mutated. Together with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, they form a massive, opaque shadow state.
And they control a huge chunk of the economy.
Conservative estimates suggest they control over 50% of the national GDP.
50%?
Yes. They own telecommunications networks, energy infrastructure, manufacturing plants, and their own financial institutions like Ansar Bank.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. If you look at how this functions, it is nothing like a normal public sector.
Not at all.
It's basically like a cartel operating inside a government trenchcoat. Our sources call it a subcontractor state.
Because the state officially owns the assets, but they subcontract the actual profit-making to these military networks.
Exactly. And this completely crushes private enterprise. Like if you are a small business owner in Tehran, you cannot compete with a military conglomerate that gets infinite no-bid contracts, pays no taxes, and literally owns the bank deciding your loan.
And we really have to look at how international sanctions interacted with that cartel, because sanctions did not weaken the military boneyard complex. No, they actually entrenched it. It created what Iranian economists call the trustee economy.
Right, because sanctions severed Iran from formal banking channels like SWIFT.
Exactly. But international trade didn't stop. It just moved into the shadows. Military-linked brokers stepped in to facilitate illicit trade through hawala networks and front companies.
And if you push trade into shadow channels, that implies a massive premium on transaction costs, right? You need middlemen.
A staggering premium. Our sources show that these brokers skim up to 30% of the country's export revenues purely in transaction fees.
30%. That's wealth vanishing into the shadow state before a single real hits the public treasury.
It is one of the most efficient mechanisms for wealth transfer from the public to a military elite in modern history. Researchers actually categorize this system as quantitatively socialist.
Wait, I need you to explain the use of socialist in this context.
I know, it sounds weird.
Yeah, because a cartel of elites skimming billions off illicit oil doesn't exactly sound like a Marxist utopia, and it definitely doesn't sound like a Scandinavian social democracy.
It's a highly specific academic term here. It means the economy is completely centralized and managed not to maximize efficiency or innovation, but to fulfill the security and political imperatives of the state.
Ah, I see.
The whole apparatus is a tool for regime survival. So credit allocation, infrastructure, import licenses, it's all decided purely to maintain the loyalty of the military elite.
Okay, so we have our baseline. A transitional government steps in. They inherit a hyperinflated currency, widespread hunger, and an economy where half the GDP is controlled by heavily armed remnants of the old regime.
Yes.
How do you possibly dismantle that without triggering total societal collapse?
Well, you have to study historical failures to understand the required sequencing. The classic cautionary tale is the Soviet Union's perestroika in the late 80s and 90s.
Wow.
Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to dismantle the central economic planning apparatus without having the legal frameworks of a free market ready to replace it.
He essentially tore down the old house before pouring the foundation for the new one.
Exactly. And the result was devastating. A 20% drop in gross national product, shattered supply chains, and an institutional vacuum that basically gave birth to the Russian oligarchs.
You can't just unplug a centralized economy overnight.
No, it plunges the population into the dark.
And that vacuum is exactly what the Iran Prosperity Project, the blueprint from Reza Pahlavi and his allied economists, is designed to prevent, right?
Yes. It lays out a highly regimented 18 to 24-month roadmap, culminating in a constitutional referendum and elections.
But the sources make it clear the elections are the easy part. The critical vulnerability is the emergency phase, the first 180 days.
Because during those first 180 days, soaring democratic idealism has to take a backseat to pure pragmatic survival.
It's macroeconomic triage. The blueprint states the immediate day one priorities are keeping government salaries flowing, the energy grid online, and food supply chains intact.
If those fail, the transition fails.
But to stabilize the bleeding and stop that 73% inflation, the plan outlines step 2, which focuses on ending fiscal dominance. How does that actually function in a crisis?
So fiscal dominance happens when a government's fiscal deficits dictate the central bank's monetary policy.
Right.
In Iran's current system, when the government runs out of money, they simply force the central bank to print more to cover the shortfall.
Which is the direct engine of their hyperinflation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So ending fiscal dominance means severing that transmission line. The central bank must be made completely independent.
So instead of monetizing the debt, which destroys purchasing power, the new government has to fund itself differently, by issuing sovereign debt.
Yes, they have to establish a domestic bond market. They finance deficits by selling bonds to the public, but because inflation is so high, they'll have to offer painfully high interest rates to convince anyone to buy them.
Which is a severe trade-off.
Very severe. High interest rates crowd out private investment and slow growth, but it's the only way to absorb excess liquidity and kill the hyperinflation.
But this brings up a massive structural critique from our sources. What does all this mean for the people who actually hold power in the shadow economy?
This is the tricky part.
Critics argue that if you just stabilize the top-level macroeconomics, issuing bonds, managing currency, but you don't dismantle the IRGC's monopolies, you haven't democratized the economy at all.
Right, you might just reproduce the exact same authoritarian structure under a new flag.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the most dangerous tightrope of the transition. You desperately need the existing bureaucracy and industries to function so people don't starve.
But those industries are intertwined with the corrupt old order.
Yes. And if the new government aggressively purges those monopolies without immediately providing a stabilized currency and a robust private sector to absorb the shock,
Unemployment skyrockets.
and the pain will be catastrophic. That level of pain inevitably triggers a reverse wave, where the public demands the return of a strongman to restore order.
It's the ultimate catch-22. You have to keep the cartel's factories running to prevent riots, But leaving the cartel in charge defeats the whole purpose of the revolution.
It does.
And compounding this nightmare is the fact that they can't survive those first 180 days on domestic capital alone. They desperately need external funding.
Desperately.
The sources estimate Iran needs roughly $100 billion in frozen overseas assets just to stabilize the currency markets.
But accessing those frozen reserves is not a simple diplomatic matter of just lifting sanctions.
Right.
The global financial system operates on strict compliance mechanisms. For a new Iranian government to get that capital, they absolutely must achieve compliance with the FATF.
The Financial Action Task Force, the international standard setter for anti-money laundering and combating terrorism financing.
Because right now, Iran is essentially a blacklisted jurisdiction.
Yeah, their current banking system is functionally designed to obscure money movement for the shadow state.
Right, and FATF compliance isn't a superficial checklist. It requires dismantling that architecture of illicit finance.
Beneficial ownership registries, opening books to international auditors, all of that.
Exactly. Global financial institutions won't touch Iranian assets until they have empirical proof that their capital isn't inadvertently funding the very illicit networks the revolution was trying to remove.
Okay, let's play this out. Say they clear the FATF hurdle, the funds are repatriated, the central bank is stabilized, and doors finally open for foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Okay.
Usually, FDI is presented as an unalloyed good. Foreign corporations build factories, transfer tech, create jobs. But our sources point out a massive risk with FDI in this specific region.
It raises a crucial question about the nature of the capital entering the country.
Yeah.
In resource-heavy regions like the Middle East and North Africa, a sudden influx of FDI can actually trigger the resource curse, or specifically Dutch disease.
Dutch disease is fascinating and completely counterintuitive. You'd assume a flood of foreign currency would help diversify the economy.
You would.
But the data from the academic studies in our stack shows the exact opposite. FDI actually increases the region's reliance on extracting coal and minerals. It just shifts dependency from oil to another raw material.
We have to look at why that capital is flowing in. Foreign investors generally aren't deploying capital to build high-tech hubs in countries with fragile institutions.
The risk is just too high for them.
Way too high. Instead, they deploy capital to extract raw resources as cheaply and quickly as possible.
Wow.
So if the new government has weak environmental regulations and a desperate need for cash, foreign investment just accelerates resource depletion.
And incentivizes local elites to engage in rent-seeking, right? Just positioning themselves as gatekeepers to skim profits off the top.
Exactly.
It's structurally similar to winning the lottery when you have a severe gambling addiction. The sudden cash doesn't solve your problems. It just funds your addiction.
That's a perfect analogy.
If the new government hasn't fixed the underlying institutional addiction to resource rents, the new foreign money just exacerbates the disease. And mechanically, Dutch disease makes it worse because the foreign currency inflow causes the local exchange rate to appreciate rapidly.
Which makes other exports, like domestic manufacturing, completely uncompetitive globally.
Effectively hollowing out whatever independent middle class you had left.
That is the core dilemma. The challenge for a new government is not simply attracting FDI, it's aggressively managing it.
Right.
They must build the institutional strength to channel that capital away from raw extraction and into inclusive sectors like manufacturing, tech, and services.
Otherwise, they haven't built a diversified economy. They've just become a better-funded petrostate that exports minerals instead of oil.
Precisely.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, looking at the hidden architecture of regime change. We've analyzed the collapse of the barrio, the insidious military boneyard shadow state, the triage of the 180-day emergency phase, and the double-edged sword of foreign capital.
It really reveals the staggering amount of macroeconomic management required just to keep a society functioning while its foundations are being rebuilt.
It does. But all of these complex mechanisms point to one unavoidable truth for you, the listener.
Yeah.
We have a tendency to romanticize the fight for political freedom.
Oh, absolutely.
We fixate on who was at the podium, what the new Constitution says, the speeches in Parliament. But this deep dive proves that true freedom is deeply, fundamentally economic.
It's about who actually controls the central bank's ledger.
Yes, it's about whether the inflation rate allows a family to save. It's about the physical price of daily bread. If the new government cannot master the accounting, the freedom promised at the ballot box is just an illusion.
A society's social contract is written in its currency just as indelibly as it is written in its laws. A failure of the former guarantees the collapse of the latter.
So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you consider these democratic transitions. We've spent this time breaking down the dangers of the old shadow economy and the severe risks of new foreign money. If a newly democratic nation finally overthrows its oppressors, but finds itself relying on the exact same flows of foreign capital, exporting the exact same natural resources that the previous dictatorship used to fund its abuses, can that society ever truly be considered free? Or have they simply managed to change the CEO of the country?
It certainly forces you to look at those statues coming down in the public square in a very different light.
It really does. Because while the statues fall to the cheers of the crowd, the real revolution is quietly waiting to see what happens when the bank opens the next morning.